Good morning. I am Lee Sang-shin from KINU, Director of Peace Institute. And we have prepared a session on the topic of emerging security and peace on the Korean Peninsula. I would like to thank everyone for joining us despite your busy schedules. We devised this topic back in February when COVID-19 was not as serious as it is today. And of course, we cannot just focus solely on COVID-19. We wanted to talk about a wider topic called emerging security. So pre and post COVID world will be two very different worlds. And this will be the topic of discussion, which I'm sure will be very insightful. The moderator will be Professor Im Kyung-hoon of KINU's Institute for Peace and Unification Structures. Thank you, Mr. Lee. As Mr. Lee has mentioned, the humankind at this point of time is swept by a very serious catastrophe of COVID-19. But other than COVID-19, we also experience climate change and ecological change that pose as threats that will only become more intense in the future. This situation means that state-based or military-based security concept should be renewed with a new paradigm and approach. Also, we are immediately facing relations with North Korea and Northeast Asian issues that have become more complex, new, and challenging. And against this backdrop, KINU has prepared this very important session. And I pay tribute to KINU for preparing this event. In fact, President Go Yo-han from KINU is joining us. I would love to invite him to give us a few words, but he is refusing very vehemently. But if you could stand up and maybe wave at the camera, because we have so many people joining us online from both Korea and abroad. So would you like to say hello to the audience? And I would like to introduce the presenters and discussants. And when I call your name, I know that we are all wearing facial masks, so we won't be able to recognize one another if we were to meet on the street. So please wave at the camera when I call your name. So first we have Mr. Cho Han-bum from KINU. And next, from Asan Institute for Policy Studies, we have Mr. Cha Du-hyun. And from INSS, Ms. Cho Eun-jung. INSS is Institute for National Security Strategy. These are the three presenters for this session. And for discussion, we have from University of North Korean Studies, Ms. Kim Tae-kyung. And also joining us all the way from the United States online, we have from Federation of American Scientists, we have Dr. Adam Mount. And Dr. Adam Mount, unlike last year, you have a gray beard. Good to see. You look even more handsome. Sometimes you come to Korea for important seminars. And so these are the two discussants for this session. I give 20 minutes to each presenter. And for discussion, you have 12 to 13 minutes to give your comments and questions. And as a moderator, one more housekeeping announcement. We have many people joining us online at home and abroad. So If you have any questions, please use the QR code you see on the screen to load your questions. Your questions will be relayed by the staff and myself, and we will select a few questions on your behalf and ask them to the speakers. And after that, to the presenters, I think I will be able to give 5 minutes each to answer the questions. And when the time comes, please give us a comprehensive answer to all the questions and comments that you have heard. So this will be how we will proceed with this session. And without further ado, I would like to move on to the presentations. I will follow the order as written in our program. So first presenter is Mr. Cho Han-bum from KINU.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to this meaningful event. It is indeed an honor for me. And I would like to thank President Ko of KINU and our staff for organizing this event despite the difficult circumstances. So I think that this topic actually is quite popular. I will be attending another meeting on a similar topic that will also be an online-only event. We are experiencing a new normal these days, indeed. But I don't want to be too pessimistic about the current situation because in the past, when we did not have any official quarantine system, we suffered the Spain flu and pest and cholera. We've overcome those healthcare challenges in the past already. So now we have more advanced civilization, science, and technology. So we will be learning a lot from this experience, but nevertheless, we will be able to overcome this situation. Today, I will be touching upon two main topics. First would be that the Korean Peninsula and East Asia is faced with a dual risk. One would be something that we've already known for a long time, which is the East Asia paradox. And the second is in Levensfeld Risk Society, Levensfeld Risk Society, that is another risk that the Korean Peninsula and East Asia is faced with. So first, the East Asia paradox, which is more similar to the traditional risk, and then we have the new Levensfeld crisis. So then what is the solution to our current challenges? The solution is cooperation. And transnational cooperation, including inter-Korean cooperation, is the way to go, is the core of my message. So I use the term one life community, or we also can say daily life community. But what this means is that we live in a joint community when it comes to the risks and the threats that we face in our daily lives. And we will have to cooperate, at least in the life world, the Levenswelt. We have to cooperate to overcome these risks. That is my recommendation. So this is a table of contents in 6 categories. I will be first talking about risk society, the unique characteristics of the modern day society. And then as one of the risks, I'll be talking about COVID-19 and also the importance of transnational cooperation. Because if you look at the modern day risks, these risks require transnational cooperation, international cooperation. And then human security crisis. Well, in order to overcome this, we need cooperation, especially in East Asia. And then the fact that the Korean Peninsula is part of a one life community, or at least we should go towards creating a one life community. So, as you know, Modern society has really advanced. If you look at the average lifespan or illiteracy, if you look at the statistics, indeed, there has been great advancements. However, along with these advancements, there is a paradox. It doesn't take a day to go from Seoul to New York. This is something that was unperceivable or unimaginable in the past, but this is now possible. There's greater convenience in our daily lives. However, along with such convenience, we are experiencing new modern day risks, and that has been touched upon in the concept of a risk society by Beck and Risikogesellschaft. So, paradox of development was talked about. And then Beck says that poverty is hierarchical, but smog is democratic. So, in the past, some risks we were able to evade, but now the modern risks, no one can avoid the modern risk. We are all exposed to the risk in the modern day society. If you look at, well, Fukushima, do you think that that tragic event has ended? No, it is ongoing actually. So the exposure to radiation that has been impacting the fish, surrounding environment, and we are consuming the fish and such natural resources. What about COVID-19? Even the leaders of the world, they have been confirmed to be COVID-19 positive. And then also cyberspace. We have these many different risks that transcend any regional or national physical borders. We talk about the modern day society being hyperconnected. And I think that actually these risks are also hyperconnected as well. So if there is a risk arising on the Korean Peninsula, then this will spread to the global community. And so this small virus that started in China has led to casualties of 800,000. And many more positive cases, of course. Of course, there are those who have not yet been diagnosed. So I think that the actual figures are much greater than what has been estimated to this point. We are indeed living in a society of hyper-connected risk. COVID-19, I think, has to be seen from a human security perspective. It is a new type, an emerging security issue. Like I said, there are many different types of risks surrounding us, and COVID-19 is just one of these new emerging risks. So, Dr. Beck talked about this risk society. And within his concept, there is a human security, risk, and crisis. If we think about traditional security, we tend to think about physical violence. But Beck said that all factors that influence human life can be considered as risks. So when we think about security, we think about the everyday lives of individuals. It's not just physical violence that affect individual lives, but rather we can think of the various rights that are being threatened, the right to existence, or any threat that can pose harm to the living standards of mankind. And now it is not just the individuals that are being threatened, but we have to think about the larger community, nations, when we think about human security. And we are seeing this through the COVID-19 incident. I talked about the hyperconnected risk society. In order to overcome this kind of hyperconnected risk, one country alone cannot solve this. Actually, we need the concerted efforts of all nations around the world because we have trade, and some trade items might have the virus or maybe have been exposed to the virus, and thus trade can lead to the spread of the virus. So the virus, COVID-19, transcends borders. We're seeing the risk transcending borders. And so COVID-19 is a very good example of the hyper-connected risk society. COVID-19 has a democratic nature. No one can be free from the risk of COVID-19. Of course, some might have the capability to spend more on the medical treatment, but nevertheless, everyone can fall victim to COVID-19. What about radiation? Is this democratic? Yes, everyone exposed to the same risks. So, the K quarantine, Korean quarantine, well, when other countries decided to just shut down their borders, what did we do? We decided to not shut down our borders. We decided to go for transparency. We have been very transparent in releasing information about COVID-19. And we can see that rather the countries that have decided to be more isolated has suffered more from COVID-19. The openness, transparency, these types of quarantine measures actually have been more successful. And that's why we need cross-border cooperation even more so. So, the East Asia paradox. To go into this topic, we have to look at Europe. Europe has formed a new order. It was able to go towards peace after World War II through the Helsinki process, and also there was massive disarmament, and also there was a security and cooperation agreements reached. So you can see that there was the CSCE and the ECSC. EU was established. There's a joint currency. So you can see that there has been a formation of new order in Europe and integration. But what about Asia? I think the situation is quite different. In Korea, on the Korean Peninsula, there's an armistice, and there is the San Francisco system still in place. So Europe has been going towards more integration, whereas in Asia, despite the end of the Cold War era, we see an East Asia paradox. The San Francisco system is still in place. There is confrontation of the Korean Peninsula. There is the rivalry between China and US. So we can see a new rivalry structure arising in East Asia. So, Levensfeld, this is the world, the life world, the world that we can perceive and feel. And we can see that actually these types of new orders exist within the world that we live in. And we are experiencing a Levensfeld or a Levensfeld crisis in East Asia. Look at this tree. This is actually a very harmful tree. I call this a Levensfeld Crisis tree. So if you look at the roots of the tree, there's a division of the Korean Peninsula, and then there is a San Francisco regime, which is still intact. And then you can see the expansion of China's military strategy, and then there is the India-Pacific strategy of the U.S. clashing with the China-Russia East Asia strategy. In the case of the Korean Peninsula, of course, there's the all-out human rights crisis in North Korea. There are so many challenges that we face with when it comes to North Korea. And then there is a security dilemma, a Cold War dilemma. And also, as you can see with the explosion of the Kaesong industrial complex, there's always the possibility of military clash. So all of these are actually restraining us or limiting the possibilities of our lives. So, Korea, China, and Japan, we share the same Levensfeld, the life world. We are intrinsically connected together when it comes to the nuclear issue, or when it comes to the yellow dust issue, or a virus. East Asia is faced with all of these common risks. So that is why the countries in East Asia have to cooperate. But actually, we can see that cooperation and conflict coexists in East Asia. The need for cooperation is there, but at the same time, we see conflict and confrontation. So what do we need? We need the recognition of a East Asia community. So we believe that this kind of the confrontation structure that we have is a norm. But actually, we have to go beyond that and go towards establishing an East Asia community. So I think that no one can win when there is confrontation between South Korea and Japan, or confrontations with any East Asia countries. So you can see that there are military expansion policies being pursued by some countries. So there is a competition there, but this will not help the East Asian countries. So even though we are not able to reach the level of Europe or EU in terms of integration, still we need to re-recognize the need for East Asia community, the need for cooperation. Of course, this is not something that we can achieve overnight. A cooperation structure is not something that we can establish overnight. So what should we do? We should first focus on the soft issues. I think this has been noted by many scholars before in the past, but soft issues are where we can find some flexibility, where there is room for easier cooperation. So we can start here with the relatively easier issues. I still believe that international cooperation when it comes to COVID-19 is still at a very initial stage. So all countries are just developing vaccines on their own without cooperation. If we are to develop vaccines through international cooperation, if all countries joined hands, then we would have seen greater progress, more rapid progress. Right now, we do not have a international organization that is providing guidance or leadership. We are not seeing that type of leadership coming out to create international cooperation or coalition for overcoming the COVID-19 situation. So I think that we perhaps might need to go for establishing international organization for cooperation in East Asia. For example, we may want to establish East Asian Human Security Organization to tackle the soft issues first in order for us to overcome confrontation in East Asia. So I don't have much time remaining, so I will have to skip some parts of my presentation. Like I mentioned, once again, soft issues. That is where the cross-border cooperation should begin. And then with a long-term engagement and participation, we have to go towards establishing peace. We have to go towards the peace process of the Korean Peninsula and development of East Asia. So, human security crisis in North Korea, the situation is quite devastating. I've heard from my sources as well. 58% of North Koreans are malnutritioned. 200,000 people are dying from tuberculosis. So North Korea is experiencing an all-out human security crisis. And in July and August, I believe, or actually I think it was in August, or rather was it July 16th. So there was about 1,200 diagnoses testing that took place, whereas the number is much larger in South Korea. So what does this mean? It means that North Korea does not have the capability to even test COVID-19. What about the African swine flu? That is an ongoing crisis, especially near the border areas of North Korea. Malaria also is spreading in North Korea as well. When South Korea was assisting North Korea, malaria was contained. But now, without our assistance, malaria is once again spreading in North Korea. So I think that we have to at least form a one life community. And what is most urgent is to first provide support for North Korea to overcome the COVID-19 crisis. And also, we need to build a body, an organization that can stably overcome the human security issues and risks. So I think that when it comes to the humanitarian support, we need institutionalization. Starting with the Imjin River, we need cooperation, especially near the border area of the two Koreas. As we have seen in the case of Germany, they started off cooperation. They started their East Germany and West Germany cooperation starting with the border region. So we should do so. So we should think about the DMZ cooperation. And also, so we should link the DMZ, International Peace Zone, with the East Asia Green Détente. I think that perhaps we could host an international organization around the DMZ area to deal with human security related issues. And perhaps we can have a DMZ cross-border cooperation organization or a DMZ knowledge sharing organization so that we can promote international cooperation and cooperation on the Korean Peninsula. So, by doing so, we'll be able to have a driving force for international cooperation for biology and peace in East Asia. So this is my conclusion. I do believe that we need cooperation in East Asia. We need trans-border, cross-border cooperation. We need cooperation between the two Koreas. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Cho. Within the limited time that I gave you, you were able to talk about the fundamental changes in the Levensfeld, the life world, and also you talked about the need for cross-border transnational cooperation in East Asia, and you made some suggestions about how such cooperation can take place. So thank you very much for your presentation.
Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Cha Do-hyun. Yes. As for the redundant parts in my paper that overlaps with Mr. Cho, I will skip those parts. Well, the topic of this forum or session is emerging security, and I think that topic was selected because of COVID-19. There are talks how WHO statistics are late or reduced, but in early August, WHO announced that 18.9 million confirmed cases occurred, 700,000 dead, and still mounting. And if we look at Northeast Asia or Asia, where Korean Peninsula is located, all countries in East Asia are exposed to COVID-19 and suffer the damages. And in the initial stages when the virus has started to spread, East Asia does not have a good record of preventing that spread because they were all in the top 10 countries where the spread was most severe. So traditional security is all about you and me, meaning that there's a clear conflict of interests and opposite points and the possibility of others being a threat to myself, defining certain states as threats. But there are threats where it is unclear who is the enemy. So that is why in East Asia and also more narrowly on the Korean Peninsula, peace issue can be linked with emerging security. And that new perspective has been rising. And realistically, the concept of emerging security in the 20th century started to receive attention because there are threats that are very much shared around the world. And emerging security is not just someone else's problem. More broadly, emerging securities include many different types of threats, such as non military threats, which would expansively include all the diplomatic conflicts other than war. And then we have social security, which was previously defined to be natural disasters or catastrophes. And even on these fronts, the international community must engage in cooperation. And physically, however, the government may say that it is safe, the people of that government must feel reassured. So we have the concept of psychological security. In the early days, when emerging security concept arose, we most often heard about terrorism, drug trafficking, piracy, and then on to illegal immigration, epidemics, and there are issues, social issues, not necessarily threats, but aging society, sprawling urbanization, multicultural convergence. So all these concepts are encompassed in the concept of emerging security. And then there's human security, the human rights of individuals, the matter of inequality. So emerging security encompasses a wide range of issues, and it all boils down to two characteristics. One, threats do not arise from certain states, so that means anyone can become a victim. And to overcome this issue, it takes more than one state. Many non state actors must be involved and can be involved in overcoming these issues. And scientific issues and economy opened up the possibility for non-state actors to be involved. Making money is what everybody wants. And for example, in the face of epidemics, developing vaccines are directly linked to the profit and interest of enterprises, corporations. So it is not a matter of which state gains or loses. And when it comes to human rights issues, non-state actors' roles are expanding because these issues transcend one nation's or one state government's abilities. So all in all these actions would mean that so far emerging securities make a shift from conflicts arising from military clashes and may open up a possibility for international cooperation to be deepened. But in the post-COVID world, well, even before COVID-19 actually, there were ideas arising that emerging securities do not necessarily lead to true cooperation because most notably the US withdrew from the Paris Convention because climate change is considered to be a common threat. And that's what everyone thought would agree on. But it actually links to each individual political interests and industrial interests in different nations. But in emerging security, the biggest reason why people believed that more cooperation would be possible was that emerging securities are less of a headache than traditional security issues. So to be more direct, emerging securities seemed less urgent. They do not cause massive deaths or injuries, and therefore there was this perception that particularly dominant powers and other countries would work to raise and build more trust and cooperate to address emerging security issues. But in fact, in the post-COVID world, some countries started to divert from that cooperation. Why? Because based on the emerging securities approaches, these threats are common for all countries. So countries needed to disclose information transparently and share their know-hows about developing vaccines and border control and standards in prevention of epidemics were expected to be coordinated among different countries, but each countries just try to address the issue individually and on their own. And sometimes some countries pointed to certain countries to be the origin of the virus. So this COVID-19 shows that emerging securities could actually inflict huge damage, and therefore each individual states acted very much based on their own interests. This is the most important consideration we must give when we consider international or inter-Korean cooperation. So emerging securities in this sense is by no means a blue ocean. So if we look at COVID-19 situation in North Korea, already in January, North Korea quickly moved to take preventive measures, probably because of the influence from China. So strictly speaking, they did not want to block the inflow of Chinese travelers. For Japan or South Korea, they gave consideration to the economic relations with China, but North Korea took the most strict, and Russia, the formerly closest countries to China, took the most strictest measures to shut down borders with China to prevent the spread of the virus. So, conclusively speaking, to a large extent, we believe that North Korea is probably suffering more from COVID-19 than South Korea, much more seriously. These issues that North Korea is faced with ultimately may influence inter-Korean relations on another level. So far, basically, North Korea believed that they held the initiative in inter-Korean relations. And despite sanctions and external difficulties, North Korea believed that it would be able to overcome those challenges and maintain initiative in inter-Korean relations. And because they have the justifiable cause behind having that initiative, they probably believe that they did not need to succumb to South Korea. And I think that was a basic perception in North Korea before COVID-19. But now, because of COVID-19, their perception can be shaken. And because South Korea responded to COVID-19 so well, North Korea could be further encouraged to cooperate with South Korea. So, in a nutshell, North Korea's policy towards South Korea and the rest of the world in the face of post-COVID-19, their policy line could change, which is a positive prospect. And secondly, we can call it a Cold War logic and structure that still remains in East Asia. And that is because the dominant powers want preferred status quo in this region of the world. Unification or peace process on the Korean Peninsula was, of course, supported by rhetoric among neighbors, but not really sincerely. But in the face of COVID-19, this very new type of epidemic, a new world is formed. And in this new world, preference for status quo is highly likely to be broken. Changing the status quo may lead to easier discussions of reconciliation and peace on the Korean Peninsula. So when it comes to economic cooperation between the two Koreas, there were some criticism saying that it's all about only smokestack industries. But inter-Korean economic cooperation involves many more other areas. And after COVID-19, the world came to learn that some of the inter-Korean cooperation industries or manufacturing itself could be a rising, not a declining industry. For example, manufacturing facial masks. There is heightened interest and attention towards the smokestack industries of manufacturing, which could be a positive factor to inter-Korean economic cooperation. And ultimately, in the face of COVID-19, different nations worked to survive on their own, but we all learned how much damage could be inflicted by COVID-19. And we all hope that COVID-19 would come to an end, but if round two of COVID-19 arises, we may expect to see much closer coordination among countries to respond to that threat. But of course, it is still difficult to just anticipate that there will be positive changes. The threat over transcends one nation, and there's strong motivation for countries to work together, but still, countries opt not to, depending on their state interests. And even with emerging security issues, countries are strongly motivated to move based on domestic politics. And if North Korea insists on their existing policy, even when it comes to healthcare and life of the people, well, North Korea still insists on actually sticking to its original policy line. And COVID-19 could, in fact, globally, diplomatic tendency talking about dialogue is strengthened, but between US and China, there is a blame game which could fuel competition. And when that happens globally, Korean Peninsula issues on the Korean Peninsula will not be resolved anytime soon, but only focused on managing the status quo and controlling North Korea's level of provocations. So that is a negative possibility. But regarding emerging securities and inter-Korean cooperation, what we must ponder on is that we cannot just pick and choose some of the concepts under emerging securities. As we have learned in the face of COVID-19, healthcare and medicine is related to opening up national borders, and how far along you are in building consensus among the public to act on and implement social distancing is directly related to democracy. Human security issue will ultimately arise. What is human security? It is ultimately about individual rights and interests that are as important and must be respected as states' interests and rights. So this links to political democratization. Between Korea, the two Koreas, if we even start a soft cooperation in healthcare and medicine, because of the power of emerging securities, we have to discuss the human rights issues and politics inside North Korea. But so far, considering inter-Korean relations, whenever these issues arose, North Korea always, without exception, went to isolation rather than cooperation. It just shut down. Human securities will inevitably give rise to the conflict between human rights and democracy and social systems. We cannot ignore that idea. We cannot just pick and choose the issues of the emerging securities that are in favor to the inter-Korean relations. Of course, for the time being, for the improvement of inter-Korean relations, we could put aside the issue for a while. But unlike our intent, these issues will arise ultimately. For example, for control of the spread of the virus, we need to use the system. So you need to rely on the prevention system and rules in the regions. What do you do with the violators of the prevention control? You can't just leave the counterparty to deal with the violators however they wish, because it will be directly in conflict with the human rights issue. So in the short term, although the inter-Korean relations are at a stalemate, the stronger the agenda setting becomes for the Korean Peninsula. South Korean government's efforts to make improvement will be supported by the international community. And even if North Korea is not willing to, life community issues and healthcare medical cooperation issues must be suggested by South Korea constantly. But as we can see under the concept of emerging securities, these issues are very strongly non-traditional security matters and non-military. But if you look at how individual states acted, domestic politics were always at play. So how to overcome these restrictions will determine whether emergency security will be a catalyst of international cooperation or become an unexpected roadblock. This is what we always have to keep in mind when we pursue emerging security cooperation. Thank you very much, Mr. Cha. You mentioned emerging securities and their relations to COVID-19 and all the other emerging security issues, how they can positively impact reconciliation and peace on the Korean Peninsula and international relations, but at the same time, some serious issues that require our consideration and research. Thank you very much.
And next, let's go on to Dr. Cho. Yes, good morning. I am Cho Eun-jung from INSS. Today I will be talking about whether inter-Korean cooperation will be possible, and also the tripartite cooperation between South and North Korea and U.S. is possible in COVID-19 prevention. And why is it not inter-Korean cooperation, but rather a tripartite cooperation? And how would this be possible? What are the limitations? What is a breakthrough to overcome these limitations and obstacles? Those are the issues that I'll be talking about. We've heard from the previous two speakers, and on top of what they have said, I will give you more details on how we can realistically pursue cooperation. I am writing a report on this topic. I've been researching it starting from early this year, but I have not completed my work, so please hear me out. I'm still in the brainstorming process, I do believe. So, as you all probably have experienced and felt, in the pandemic era, health security is closely related to quarantine. It's not just a rhetoric. We've all experienced the situation. So in the past, I think that we were caught in a paradigm that was military security focused, but now we are experiencing non-military, human-related security issues, and especially the healthcare-related issues. Everyone has probably felt this. On the Korean Peninsula, I think that there exists still the traditional military risk, which we cannot turn our eyes away from. But at the same time, we have other risks and threats. And we have to think about how we can deal with these new emerging security risks. So how will we do that? That is a very important question. We need a change of mindset in order for us to effectively tackle these emerging security issues. So first of all, I want to explain this from a relational perspective and another from an approach perspective. If we look at the COVID-19 crisis, we can see that there is a unique characteristic that is different from the previous security paradigm. In the military security threat, there is a zero-sum game. Someone loses, someone wins. But when it comes to the virus, that is not so. If there is a virus that spreads in one country, the others are affected as well. So when it comes to the war against the virus, All countries are affected, and that is why we need cooperation. And so North Korea, Iran, and some of the known enemy states when it comes to military threats from a military security perspective, these types of countries that have been excluded from security cooperation now have to join in and cooperate together. If not, we will not be able to win the war against the virus in the global community. So we have to raise awareness about this fact. And number two, when it's same with our relationship with North Korea. If you look at the global spread of COVID-19, we are in need. You will recognize that we are in need of a new paradigm. So then, what should we do? We have to think about the relational aspect. Of course, I'm not saying that we have to replace the traditional security paradigm, but we need something that can serve as a complementary measure to more effectively deal with the emerging security issues. And so, from a relational perspective, first of all, I think that multilateralism would not hurt inter-Korean relations, but rather we can have more parties coming in to support the promotion of inter-Korean relations. So we need to expand relationships to be more multilateral. Let me use a metaphor. Now, as you all know, inter-Korean relations are stagnated, and that's the same for the U.S. and North Korea relations. So if you look at the bilateral relations, we're seeing a stagnation, or rather deterioration and instability. We are in a difficult state when it comes to these bilateral relations. But why don't we think of a bicycle? When we had a two-wheel bicycle, if we do not pedal at a certain speed, the bicycle will fall. You will fall from the bicycle as soon if you do not reach a certain speed. But what about a bicycle with supporting wheels? When the bicycle stops, or if the speed is slow, still you can enjoy stable operation, or you can stably ride the bicycle despite the slowing speed or despite halting. So I prepared a slide to enhance your understanding about the situation in DPRK, which will in turn help you better understand inter-Korean relations. So let me explain this first. North Korea states that it is actually a country free from COVID-19, but I'm a little skeptic about this claim because although North Korea emphasizes that it is a COVID-19 free country and it claims that it has diagnosis kits, clearly it has only limited access to diagnosis kits, and also you're seeing other contagious diseases spreading. And also, if you look at the sewage facilities, very deteriorated. There's the issue of malnutrition throughout North Korea. And then also, North Korea has its border with China and Russia, with these countries that have high numbers of COVID-19 positive cases. So I think that it's difficult to believe, having said that, North Korea has been free from COVID-19. And for the past couple of years, we have seen an increase of Chinese tourists visiting North Korea. And so it's very difficult to believe what North Korea is claiming in terms of being a COVID-19 free country. So I presume that North Korea is also experiencing a quarantine crisis, and what I am going to say from now on is based on that assumption. So the third part of my presentation is what I want to emphasize the most. How are we going to implement tripartite cooperation between ROK, DPRK, and the U.S.? Before I go into this in detail, let me just add a couple of facts that are not included in my slides. Now, I want to mentioned this in order to help your understanding on why we need tripartite cooperation. Were there no cases of cooperation of this type in the past? There was, but very limited. And also, if you look at inter-Korean cooperation, you can see that there are many different statements and declarations between the two Koreas, and also from 2000 to 2010. 39.6 billion won was injected into North Korea by South Korea to support healthcare and quarantine. So we have seen inter-Korean cooperation in this field in the past. After 2007 and 2008, I think, however, there was very limited inter-Korean cooperation because of the stagnated and deteriorated relationship between the two Koreas, and then came the sanctions. So we have seen very limited cooperation between ROK and DPRK and also with the US as well. And then there was the new flu, and then Ebola virus, MERS. These were some exceptional cases where North Korea first reached out to South Korea for cooperation. And also, it was not for the people of North Korea, but rather for the workers at the Kaesong Industrial Complex. Various support was provided. Equipment was provided in the form of leasing the equipment because of the sanctions. So that was another type of cooperation. And then there was the Pyongyang Joint Declaration on September 19th of 2018. And so the need for cooperation was implemented in this declaration. And also, there was an agreement about, or discussions between the two Koreas about exchanging information about infectious diseases in the two Koreas, but this was not actually implemented in full-fledged. Well, I think that, however, despite the urgent need for healthcare cooperation, inter-Korean relations came first. So because the relationship fell or deteriorated, there was no tangible cooperation taking place in the area of healthcare, despite the urgency. But we need cooperation in this field. And also, for joint response against COVID-19, we need the institutions, but these institutions are not there. So we need to prepare ourselves in order to work together with North Korea in the field of healthcare. So having said that, I would like to give some recommendations on how we can indeed cooperate in this field. And so I hope that you can listen to me and think of this as a brainstorming session. If you have any other good ideas, please let me know. The first suggestion I would like to make is related to building and sending a smart medical ship. Now, when we commemorated our normalization of ties with Brazil, the 60th anniversary, what we did was South Korea sent a medical ship to the Amazon basin to provide medical services in a remote manner to the residents there. So in order to overcome the limitations of infrastructure, we decided to send this remote ICT technology mounted medical ship. It was a smart medical ship. It was difficult to use the land transportation to aid or support Brazil. And we thought about what we could do. Would it be able to use the open waters or the coastal waters? And also, when it comes to the sanctions and humanitarian support, would this be possible? So I thought about this case when I thought about North Korea and thought about the sanctions. Would we be able to receive a suspension of sanctions for this particular case so that we can indeed provide this kind of medical support in the form of a smart medical ship? So what came to mind was that I think that the coastal areas of North Korea is indeed not in a good condition, but the inland areas of North Korea is even in a more devastated situation. So, along with providing a smart medical ship, I thought about utilizing a smart quarantine train as well. And another suggestion, the second suggestion I would like to make, is about building a Kaesong Industrial Complex as a global medical and quarantine hub. To my understanding, in the United States, there was a shortage of masks. It was the same in South Korea as well. We did not have enough supply of masks for some time. Actually, there was a Korean company that had a mask manufacturing plant located in Kaesong, which the company was no longer able to use. But when I contacted some companies that had plants in Kaesong, these companies said that it only would take them 1 to 2 weeks to transform the manufacturing plants that they have in Kaesong into plants that can produce masks or hand sanitizers or other supplies that are required for healthcare preventive measures. So if we are able to transform the Kaesong Industrial Complex as an international medical and quarantine hub and produce these types of healthcare and medical supplies there, I think that perhaps we can indeed reach a momentum that can improve relations with North Korea and promote more cooperation. And another suggestion is to support DPRK's independent production of essential medical supplies from WTO's pandemic declaration. So, of course, to talk about this, we have to talk about the WTO TRIPS, the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. This was established in 1995. If you look at Article 31-B, it states that in the case of a national emergency or in the case of extreme urgency or emergency or for public non-commercial use, TRIPS can be waived. And intellectual properties can be used without paying a cost. So the pandemic declaration actually can enable DPRK to be free from having to pay royalties for essential medical supplies. If North Korea has the base ingredients and the materials to produce the medical supplies, then I do believe that perhaps North Korea will be able to come up with the drugs and medicine by manufacturing it on their own. So malaria or COVID-19 and other respiratory diseases, perhaps North Korea might be able to manufacture some of the drugs on its own if the base materials are provided to them. And the fourth proposal or recommendation is to support the reform of medical information system of DPRK. DPRK, of course, it needs assistance and support, but at the same time, what it needs to do is unify this information system that it has, especially in the medical sector and the healthcare sector. So this can actually be the foundation for improving the healthcare situation in North Korea. So perhaps the private sector organizations can play a role here because the healthcare issues actually are relatively less politically sensitive. These would be issues that can be more easily dealt with or tackled for cooperation. And along with that, number 5, perhaps we can jointly develop an early warning system for infectious diseases and natural disasters in East Asia. If we build this kind of a system or a network, then we can have North Korea join in. If we reform the medical information system of North Korea and the two Koreas share information in the healthcare and medical field, then we can promote cooperation between the two Koreas and also promote cooperation in East Asia as we extend this kind of a system or network to other countries in East Asia. So I think that someone mentioned about the One Life community in East Asia, but I think that North Korea also has to participate. So these are the 5 recommendations or suggestions that I would like to make. And last but not least, this is my conclusion. So what are the roles that the U.S., South Korea, and North Korea can play in this tripartite cooperation, and what are the limitations or obstacles, and how can we overcome these obstacles? So this part I have not been able to include in my slides, but after I develop further my report, I will be able to include those details and release it as I publish my report in September. So when it comes to the smart medical ship, since Korea already has experience of building this kind of a medical ship, South Korea can manufacture the ship, and North Korea can provide anchorage in Siniju or Nampo, and Myeongchon, Cheongjin. These areas can be used as the area of the ports. And the U.S. international community can perhaps suspend temporarily the sanctions against North Korea for humanitarian support to North Korea in the form of a medical ship. And also, not only if suspension of sanctions is difficult, at least if there is an official support declared by the U.S. or the international organizations, this might make cooperation in this form easier and help us further promote cooperation. And next, the Kaesong Industrial Complex. Well, I think that South Korea has to come up with new legislation for reoperating the Kaesong Industrial Complex. Then what can North Korea do? Well, North Korea will have to lift the seizure on the equipment of Kaesong Industrial Complex and also prepare for reoperation of the Kaesong Industrial Complex. What about the United States? I asked a lot of experts on some of the challenges of this idea, and a lot of them talked about the licensing that has to be provided by the United States for made in Kaesong products, and also the suspension or postponement of sanctions of related materials. But there is also the issue of the origin country and the country that produces the made in Kaesong products being different, and also the issue of providing wage to the North Korean labor workers. That can be actually a violation of the sanctions against North Korea. So I thought about how we can then overcome these obstacles. First of all, when it comes to the difference between the origin country and the production country, perhaps we can overcome this obstacle by simplifying the customs process. North Korea, South Korea, and the United States perhaps can work together to think about ways to simplify customs requirements and processes, and also in terms of the wage, if we do not provide the wage in the US dollar, or perhaps if we provide it in an in-kind manner, then maybe we can overcome this obstacle. And number 3, with that, I would like to conclude my presentation, but supporting North Korea to be self-sufficient in manufacturing essential medicine and medical supplies, I think that the greatest obstacle would be the limited capability of North Korea to produce such products. So I thought about perhaps transforming the manufacturing plants already existing in North Korea, such as the Kaesong plants, to produce these medicines, or perhaps we can have the international organizations to come in. They can play a role, for example, play the role of inspector or monitoring the operations at the plants. And very briefly, number 4, if I may mention this. So establishing an information sharing system for inter-Korean cooperation in the field of quarantine and upgrading North Korea's medicine information system. I think that, first of all, the liaison office has been destroyed. We have to restore that first, and we will have to have experts from the 2 Koreas to work on this system development together. And also, perhaps we can have a third party, perhaps international organization, play the role of providing, transmitting the medical information. So the threats of the pandemic is felt by everyone. And I think that we have to think about what we should do at this moment. I made 5 suggestions to promote cooperation in this time and era, but we also have to think about number 1, is North Korea willing to be on board? And number 2, is the United States willing to ease sanctions or postpone or give a suspension of sanctions for humanitarian purposes, at least temporarily? So number 1, is North Korea willing to receive support? Is it willing to be on board? I think that in the past, North Korea thought that if it changes, it will be isolated, rather, from the international community. But that is not the case indeed. So there is a need for a change of perception. And in order to change the perception of North Korea, we have to open up channels and try to continue to communicate with North Korea. Number 2, will the U.S. be willing to suspend or postpone or exempt sanctions? And also, we have to think about why do we need the cooperation of the United States? To answer this question, we have to think about the case with Vietnam. For the normalization and opening of doors of North Korea, we have to think about who will benefit from such moves. I think that the United States has nothing to lose if North Korea does indeed open up to the international community. It can be in its benefit, and so I think that as the world is faced with the COVID-19 crisis, we need a change of mindset and change of perception, and everyone has to cooperate. With that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Cho and all our speakers. So we've heard from 3 speakers. It seems that they have been well prepared, but just because of the time constraint, I was only able to give 20 minutes each. This session is being joined by audience utilizing an online platform. And I will go back home and log on to access YouTube to once again watch and view this session. I'm sure that those who are joining us via the online platform, you will learn a lot. And after the session is over, please once again revisit and watch it again to help your understanding about this topic. So why don't we go on to the panel discussion? And questions and comments are welcomed. First of all, Dr. Kim Tae-kyung.
Good morning. I am Kim Tae-kyung from the University of North Korean Studies. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this meaningful Korea Global Forum for Peace. And we are discussing this very important topic of emerging security and peace on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you to KINU for preparing this event. I think all 3 papers handled post-COVID peace building on Korean Peninsula from the perspective of emerging security, which was very important and timely. In the post-COVID world, regarding the direction of Korean peace process and challenges, there were predictions presented, and as for policy measures, how much and how will they change were also discussed. Pandemic is changing the perception of security, peace, and cooperation, and in the mid to long term, from the new or emerging security on traditional and comprehensive security perspective, what kind of new cooperation will be possible, and how will they contribute to building peace? So regarding these questions, the presenters of this panel looked at the need for paradigm shift that encompasses emerging security and the need for common response to the common threats of the humankind, and also for human security cooperation on the Korean Peninsula, what kind of conditions there are, and policy suggestions were also made. In the post-COVID world, over the perception of security, cooperation, and peace, we are making a transformation, and we need to change our perception and share the belief that in Korean Peninsula prospects and initiatives, new change is needed. And I think all panels have discussed the concept of emerging security, so I'd like to ask you a common question and also detailed question to each speaker. First of all, it is mentioned that in the post-COVID Korean Peninsula, the global healthcare and medical crisis brings threats under the concept of human security. You define different threats, and you discuss the urgency of common response to the threats and the cooperation measures. But I wonder whether securitizing all these crises and threats through emergent security and human security would be productive for creating cooperation at the Korean Peninsula and East Asia level. Of course, anyone can be a victim of common risks of terrorism, drug, massive refugees, and so forth. To address them with common response and cooperation, I think that there is a certain level of common identity that is needed. Then how can we secure that common identity? I would like to listen to your views. For example, Mr. Cha, in your paper, you said you discussed the opportunities and the challenges of peace from emerging security perspective. You mentioned both the possibility of North Korea's change and its stiffness not to. So these opportunities and changes are coexisting. But what kind of new route can spur opportunities? On top of expanding the scope of security to emerging security and healthcare security, we need to transition our perception of peace and cooperation. And to create a certain level of common identity, I think we must go beyond just defining and expanding our concept of threats, common threats, and enemies. So, in terms of creating this new and common identity, Mr. Cho's idea of one life community is very important. If a one life community, rather than becoming a community that jointly responds to the threats, and it becomes more about connecting humanitarian support, development and cooperation, and economic cooperation, I believe that all the threats can be reduced to security. We need to distinguish between humanitarian cooperation and political and military issues. And if humanitarian level can encompass the Korean Peninsula and all the life communities in East Asia, we can also discuss based on keywords of human rights, humanitarianism, environment, ecosystem, and peace. Next, is there any clash between the conventional and the emerging concept of security? If you look at Korean Peninsula alone, the human security threat of COVID-19 are expected to force North Korea to become more cooperative with Korea and the rest of the world, or there's also concern that it will just stick to its hostilities and exerting nuclear power and distrusting South Korea. How North Korea perceives the current COVID-19 threat and with whom it will pursue cooperation based on trust is the key question. The steps North Korea is taking show that Cold War structure and its limits seem to have a greater influence rather than the opportunities opened up by emerging security. And COVID-19 seems to be a parameter that amplifies the limits. North Korea claims that it is COVID-free, but in January 2020, it started to roll out its domestic prevention campaign. So I think that North Korea joins the world in perceiving COVID-19 as a serious threat. On January 22nd, travel agencies of North Korea notified the suspension of flights to China, and relatively quickly and strongly, it shut down borders, restricted mobility domestically, imposed quarantine and inspection to stop the spread of the virus. On January 20th, the first official report came out from China about human-to-human infection. And Hebei province, including Wuhan, was shut down. Immediately, North Korea set up its national emergency prevention system. It shows how gravely North Korea perceives COVID-19. But from China and Russia, North Korea received test kits and also from UN organizations and NGOs. But when it comes to humanitarian support from South Korea, North Korea remains unresponsive. As such, common perception of COVID-19 and the rise of serious threat to emergency security does not necessarily lead to cooperation. If you look at Korea on January 20th in 2020, Korea officially allowed individual tourism to North Korea and thereby attempting to defrost inter-Korean relations from the collapse of the Hanoi talks. But and with the April 2019 policy speech by Kim Jong-un, North Korea seems to have a very skeptical view about South Korea being a mediator. And then there were a series of statements released by Kim Tae-gon and Kim Yo-jong saying that South Korea's role is presumptuous or is valuing alliance over fraternity, which led to the explosion of the liaison office in June. But on January 30th, while North Korea shut down its borders completely, it sent President Xi Jinping, a monetary consolation and a letter, and in May, sent another letter congratulating China on the decline in regional infection. While remaining open the possibility of talks with the U.S., North Korea seems to be criticizing U.S.'s suspension of support to the WHO and supporting China's efforts. So in terms of COVID-19 international cooperation, North Korea is pro-Chinese. So on the Korean Peninsula, not only common threats are existing, but the interests and basic judgments that are being made seem to be dominantly uncooperative, and Cold War structure remains intact. So I gave you each common questions, and now I want to give each speaker a specific question. To Mr. Cho, pandemic is as democratic, like smog, but although everyone is exposed to healthcare and medical risk, I think that if you look at the reality, the damages from that risk is undemocratic and unequal. So in terms of domestic politics, the burden of the pandemic, socioeconomic burden, differs by the class, culture, race, and gender. And international politics-wise, underdeveloped nations vulnerable to the COVID-19 seems to be experiencing more of a threat in terms of nourishment or health hygiene. So I think that this inequality, in a way, hinders international cooperation. So how should the undemocratic nature and inequality be dealt with? And Mr. Cha, you mentioned two sides of human security. On the one hand, the human rights of civil political rights will become a challenge, while on the other side, the pandemic threat could open up the possibility of cooperating with North Korea. But on the other hand, is there a way to start cooperation in economic, social, and cultural rights where North Korea sympathizes? And considering human security in North Korea, considering the impact of humanitarian issues due to sanctions, COVID-19 on top, and then combined with COVID-19 and climate risk and natural disasters, I think that we should stress the right to food and right to health. What do you think of this? And finally, to Ms. Cho, you presented specific policy suggestions regarding trilateral cooperation between U.S., North Korea, and South Korea. I think they are very meaningful in terms of emerging security. However, considering the current North Korean situation, only the bilateral cooperation with China or Russia or humanitarian support from international organizations seem to be possible. So as humanitarian supplies are entering North Korea through the border with China, what is your view on the measures and possibility of small-scale multilateral cooperation among North, South Korea, and China? Thank you very much.
지금
Thank you very much. So that was a very detailed discussion. And I will give opportunities to the speakers to respond later on. I will be able to give about 5 to 6 minutes. So if there are any points that you would like to emphasize, highlight, then please do so later on. So next, I would like to invite Dr. Adam Mount. So comments and questions, please.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I just want to express my gratitude for such a timely, such a informative panel. I did not expect an update on Husserl to get brushed up on my continental philosophy, but I'm very glad to have it. And the other panelists have been remarkably constructive, I think. Thank you so much to everyone who helped arrange. I regret that I can't be there in person, but thank you to the KINU staff who helped enable my participation. I'd like to talk a little about just how important this concept of emerging security is, especially in the current context. So please allow me to take a slightly broader sort of look at the concept of emerging security generally. COVID, well, the first thing to say is that this concept bears remarkable resemblance to a number of concepts that were developed in the United States in the 1990s, certainly, but are seeing a new resurgence. These concepts started to think of security like this emerging security perspective as more general, as more diverse than hard security measures, not solely reducible to the kind of Cold War dynamics that characterized nuclear weapons competition, conventional military deterrence, and standoffs. But as Dr. Cha mentioned, started to sort of diversify how we think about security. COVID, in my view, demonstrates the validity of this perspective. It demonstrates just how important it is to recognize that what we sort of sometimes pejoratively call soft security issues have massive influences on relationships and diplomatic processes that with important sort of hard security states, but also the fact that these so-called soft security issues directly affect the interests of the United States and its allies. I think it's unfortunate that many people in sort of recovering some of these concepts in the United States will tend to focus on COVID. The reason is that COVID is obviously overwhelming. It is absolutely sort of calamitous in some areas. But it's important to recognize that COVID demonstrates just how important this perspective is more generally. It is vitally important to recognize that security is not reducible just to sort of nuclear stability, strategic stability questions, or military questions. It's important to recognize that there are more emerging security issues than just COVID. Food security, we've mentioned, gender equality, and the security of women, especially and including in North Korea. Energy issues, economic stability, including smuggling and counterfeiting, but also broader issues of macroeconomic trade, and then as well as human rights issues, both on the civil side and on the sort of subsistence and humanitarian side. And I think Mr. Cho's comment of a human security crisis in North Korea is very well taken at this point. All of these issues have been perennial problems in North Korea, but COVID will only exacerbate many of these challenges. It would be harder to overcome food security issues, especially with the recent rains and the typhoon in North Korea. but it'll also exacerbate this sort of stratified nature of the North Korean international trading economy. It'll make it very, very difficult for sort of this middle elite of North Korean sort of traders that are not directly working for government trading agencies to expand their influence in North Korean society and their sort of freedom to operate in economic terms across borders. That class of North Koreans, which isn't just hypothetical anymore, is absolutely critical to the evolution of North Korea into a country that has more of a stake in regional stability. But the lesson here is that these emerging security issues, to a considerable extent, depend on internal trends within North Korea. Human rights, legal reform, marketization, deeply embedded norms of gender equality that sort of characterize the market system and the economic system in North Korea. It's important to recognize that if emerging security issues affect the national security issues or the national security interests of the United States, South Korea, other allies as well, that to a considerable extent, those issues depend on internal trends within North Korea. That's why it's so frustrating and so unfortunate that the United States, certainly, but also South Korea, has almost no influence over the internal evolution of North Korea. Not in the sense of sort of democratizing the country dramatically or forcefully, but in terms of shaping how North Korea evolves. The fact that we've tended to reduce security to nuclear weapons issues and thought of negotiations on these emerging security issues as being concessions to North Korea has deprived of us of influence over North Korea's internal evolution. I was part of an international study group that released a report last year with 14 experts from the United States and from allied countries, including South Korea. It was directed with Andrea Berger, a Canadian. And this group taught me so much about the North Korean challenge. But the core argument there was that the challenge from North Korea was not reducible to hard security issues, but rather sort of many-sided. It was all of these sort of manifold challenges aren't reducible to one another. And it's vital that we confront each of them simultaneously and at the same time. So the primary argument that I want to make here is that emerging security issues are not ancillary to hard security issues in any way. It's important to recognize the interrelations between emerging security issues, and it's important to recognize how emerging security issues affect hard security issues. Two major reasons why we shouldn't think of emerging security issues as ancillary to traditional hard security issues. One is that we shouldn't think of them as less consequential or secondary to nuclear disarmament. The first reason for this is that the United States and South Korea and other allies are not just concerned with a disarmed North Korea. There are a variety of ways you can imagine a nuclear-free North Korea, and not all of them would be good for the United States and South Korea if it led to internal instability, to war, to other effects on South Korea that damage its national security interests. So it's not just about disarmament, it's about a stable security relationship in Northeast Asia, not just with respect to North Korea, but also with respect to Beijing as well. So that we've got to properly conceive of our interests as being, in terms of regional stability, thought of broadly, but also over the medium and long term. So not just this year, next year, in terms of how quickly and how much can we get in terms of a arms control agreement, but as a broader portfolio of issues that require our attention. The second reason that emerging security issues are not secondary or ancillary to disarmament is that management of each of these issues is critically important to achieve disarmament. I think COVID is sort of instructive in this regard. I think one of the sort of unfortunate lessons of COVID is that it will not necessarily help build momentum towards an arms control agreement. It distracts attention in the United States. It will distract attention in North Korea. It will make it difficult to sort of arrange meetings. It makes North Korea more mistrustful of the United States. It sort of puts more pressure on them to demonstrate strength internally, but also to demonstrate strength and independence relative to the United States. I think the unfortunate implication is that we are unlikely to see an arms control agreement before the end of the year, and probably also not in the early in the next US presidential term, which starts in January. So the second major reason why we shouldn't think of emerging security issues as ancillary to hard security issues is that it's not necessary that a focus on emerging security issues adds momentum to a diplomatic peace process. I think there are many in the United States on the left, but also in Seoul, who are inclined to think that if we could sort of diversify the agenda and the portfolio with respect to North Korea, that will sort of necessarily lend momentum towards a peace agreement. One reason, as Dr. Cha noted, I think very perceptively, is that a focus on certain emerging security issues can inhibit diplomatic progress and create tension between Seoul and Pyongyang and the United States. Another is just the impediments, for example, that it will throw up in any diplomatic process. A third, I think, speaks to Ms. Cho's point about trilateral cooperation. If I had my way and the International Study Group had its way, US support, on the sort of tricycle of diplomacy, which is just such a lovely metaphor. I mean, I was smiling because it was just, every now and then you find a sort of analogy that's so perfect. And that's a really lovely argument. Is that on this sort of tricycle of diplomacy, it shouldn't just be that the US contribution is limited to sanctions relief. I think we should be willing and able to do much more, to collaborate multilateral means of investing and supporting economic coordination with North Korea, to doing sort of strictly managed and monitored economic projects in North Korea that serve our interests and help shape North Korea's evolution in a more productive direction. I think the US should be willing to do some of these things, not just sort of alleviate sanctions. But by the way, on this sort of question of sanctions, this is a sort of perfect example of why you might want to, for example, set up a dedicated procurement channel for international humanitarian aid to be able to find its way into North Korea, to create sanctions white lists so that there's a dedicated channel where you don't have to sort of go through the entire sanctions exemption process, but there are some agents and organizations that are presumptively approved to transmit any kind of medical aid that North Korea is willing to accept. And we should absolutely be willing to do that, including, Ms. Cho, I think exactly right on this point, not just in terms of palliative relief in the near term, but in terms of a long-term effort to strengthen North Korea's medical system. Specifically because a healthy North Korean populace is one that helps us create a more stable regional security balance over the medium term. But the third reason why, unfortunately, this sort of trilateral security cooperation may not work extremely well, and so why a focus on emerging security issues can't necessarily add momentum to a peace process, is that the United States, unfortunately, is not in a condition, not in a circumstance where we're able to provide that much assistance in the near term. I wish it were otherwise, but the U.S. COVID response has struggled enormously, and early in the next, the early months and years of the next presidential administration, if the election flips over, but frankly also if it doesn't, are going to be consumed with just trying to put out the fire that's raging internally in terms of COVID. And so we have very few resources to spare. And in fact, we're just trying to meet our own medical needs for PPE and masks, ventilators, hospital beds. I wish it were otherwise, but it's a good demonstration of why the United States needs to get its own house in order to play a constructive role in international society and these emerging security issues. So with that, happy to answer any questions. And thank you again so much for such an informative panel.
예, 대단히 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. So, because we are holding this meeting through the online channel, we are faced with the challenge of limited time. But then at the same time, because we have invited Dr. Mount all the way from Washington, as a moderator, perhaps I can use my autonomy as my moderator to ask you a question. Would that be okay? So you talked about the emerging security issues and the traditional security issues, and I think that everyone agrees that we have to find policy solutions to tackle both. And my question is as follows. Within the U.S. policy community, when it comes to the emerging security issues that require a multilateral approach, do you think that we will be able to mobilize the U.S. policy community to join in on this type of multilateral approach? Because even if it's not Trump, I think that there has been a turn towards greater isolism, I think, or so. I'm thinking, how much support can we receive for such multilateral support or approach within the U.S. policy community? So maybe you can answer this in about 1 or 2 minutes.
That's a question, right? Books and books on. I wish I had a slam dunk answer for you. It depends a great deal on the outcome of the election. U.S. President Donald Trump has not sort of signaled that he is moving towards a change in how he thinks about multilateralism and coordination with U.S. allies and partners. So far, he's been very consistent on that front, that the United States is going to go it alone, and his America First approach is the right way to go. There has been sort of a handful of transactional points of cooperation, including on COVID with U.S. partners, but they've been inconsistent. And I think that, that there's a much more robust multilateral approach available. I think if Senator then Vice President Biden wins the presidency, I think you would see a dramatically different approach. There are long-term trends towards sort of an isolationist framework in the United States, but this is not shared in that part of the Democratic Party in the United States. Many of these people grew up thinking about emerging security issues early in their career in the 1990s, including people like Tony Lake, Tony Blinken, sort of grew up in this, sort of came of age in this perspective. And it's very much knitted into how many senior Biden administration and Biden campaign advisors think about the U.S. position in the world. So, you can read much of this sort of literature and speeches that Biden has put out, and multilateral cooperation and coordination always have pride of place. in those speeches and documents. They're very, very careful to communicate just how much allied interests mean to the United States, and just how important our role in the international community is. So I think you would see a pretty dramatically different approach. Easier said than done, but I think that's the direction that a Biden administration would like to head.
갑작스러운 질문을 드렸는데 아주 효율적으로
Yes, thank you very much for answering that sudden question in a very efficient manner. And so we've heard from all three speakers and also our two panelists. So I would like to give an opportunity to the speakers to respond to our panel discussants. Now, we have received one question that is directed to Dr. Cho, but still, nevertheless, I think that perhaps the other speakers can also answer this question, because the question is, even though South Korea makes great proposals, quality proposals to North Korea, it will be difficult to persuade North Korea. So how are you going to persuade North Korea to cooperate? That was the question. So in relation to this topic, also, I would like to give a follow-up question. Now, this meeting, I think, is a session that requires a lot of policy consensus building. And within the Korean society, I think that we are not yet prepared to propose to North Korea and the international community to cooperate. So when we think about how well prepared South Korea is, or what should the direction for reaching an agreement between the two Koreas is, in terms of these topics, I think we have to think a little bit more. And also, because we need the cooperation of the international community, well, it involves a lot of issues, including the crisis situation or the disasters in East Asia. As you know, there are so many different emerging security issues. So I think that at least we have to be able to persuade the East Asian countries to cooperate together. And for that, we need to come up with perhaps an institutional framework for such cooperation. So have you thought about this? If so, then please give us some ideas, your thoughts. Perhaps this is a too broad concept that I'm talking about. But if you have thought about this, please share your views. Thank you. So why don't we first allow Dr. Cho to respond? Yes. Well, first I would like to answer Dr. Kim Tae-kyung's answer. You asked that the current risks are democratic, but actually those who suffer, they suffer in an undemocratic manner. There is inequality in terms of responding to issues such as COVID-19. That is true, because advanced countries can be more effective and efficient in terms of dealing with this crisis situation as compared to developing countries. But the U.S. is more advanced than South Korea, but when it comes to dealing with COVID or quarantine, I think that Korea is more advanced. Look at this room. This is perfectly quarantined and sanitized, but we cannot stay in this room forever. As long as we do not get rid of the source risk, the virus, everyone will be exposed to risk. That's what I meant in terms of democratization of the risks. And I talked about the need for cross-border cooperation. That is the only solution to this pandemic crisis. Now, we have panelists from the U.S. as well. But when it comes to the new emerging security issues, we need multilateralism. And as you know, well, there was the Libya nuclear issue. What happened to Libya? What happened after getting rid of the nuclear program? It's faced with many other risks, even more serious risks. So North Korea, it's exposed to a risk that is not only limited to nuclear. There's so many risks surrounding North Korea. So we have to resolve them. And South Korea and the U.S. has an alliance relationship. And In the view of U.S., for example, people like Bolton, it may seem that if we get rid of the nuclear risk, then everything will be okay on the Korean Peninsula. But in the eyes of South Korea, that is not so. We are also exposed to many different risks related to North Korea. So these are also human security risks as well. We have to coordinate in terms of these human security risks. We have to work together. So the U.S., which is currently only trying to focus on the nuclear risk, unlike the U.S., South Korea and North Korea has to focus on many other risks, and that, I think, is the dilemma that we are in. I think that the two sides, the U.S. and the two Koreas, perhaps have to coordinate on how to work out this issue because there are so many diverse risks. And Kim Jong-un, I think that it's most interested in the security of its regime. Now, I think that if human security risk consists in a prolonged manner, that regime will not be sustainable. Of course, North Korea is pursuing self-reliance, self-rehabilitation, but if human security risks continue, then the regime will be unsustainable. So I think that right now North Korea is focusing on dealing with these human security risks because it knows that these risks are threats for the regime. So we have to come up with ways to deal with these risks and cooperate in a manner that is acceptable to North Korea. I think that if we propose something that is acceptable, then North Korea will be persuaded and will be willing to come on board. And when I look at the COVID-19, I know that this is a crisis situation, but at the same time, like Dr. Cho said, this can also be an opportunity. So we have to think about the post-COVID-19 era. We have to think about a creative solution, creative ways to cooperate after post-COVID-19. Of course, there is a competition between China and U.S., and within that confrontational paradigm of G2, it will be difficult. So I think that we have to start with the soft issues within the inter-Korean relations and East Asia, and then go to expand. Thank you.
부탁드립니다.
Next, Mr. Cha. Ms. Kim Tae-kyung asked about the opportunities and challenges and how to spur up opportunities. Well, basically, I am discussing emerging security issues and the various attempts made. But if bilateral or multilateral relations are too wide, it may not lead to tangible results. So I want to find answers in small-scale multilateral relations. There has been mentioned the trilateral relations between U.S. and the two Koreas, but when it comes to healthcare, in this region, China, Korea, and Japan were the hardest hit by COVID-19 in the region. And North Korea claims that it is COVID-free, the reason being to save the face and pride of the regime. So based on this, I think we can start with a small-scale multilateral relations to induce North Korea to come to the talking table and then widen that multilateral scale. And ultimately, I really agree with Adam that humanitarian cooperation is fully possible. And one of the considerations that must be given is that humanitarian cooperation is interlinked with human rights, and we should provide pressure North Korea unspokenly of this pressure. So humanitarian support sometimes only focuses on helping the victims and not discussing or handling the issue of the offender. I think, as Mr. Cho said, North Korea is fully aware, but still somebody has to remind them of the issue because they are a counterparty of our negotiation. If South Korean government is unable to raise the issue, it should be NGOs or civil society to remind North Korea of the fact that there are human rights issues it must ultimately face. And that leads to human security. So what we can immediately do right away in terms of multilateral mechanism, I think can be found in COVID-19. There are two disruptions of COVID-19. Number one, physical insulation between countries and insulation of governments. But in a pandemic, physical installation is inevitable for border control. But the problem is installation of information, not government information. Information should be shared in this situation. But other than the number of confirmed cases, many countries refuse to share information transparently. So exchanging information is important, and although we think that North Korea is manipulating its numbers, but nevertheless, inducing North Korea to be a part of sharing information itself is significant. For example, we can set up a disaster information exchange center together with relevant nations to address natural disaster or epidemic information. And that's where we can start an easy cooperation. Thank you very much.
다음은
And next, Dr. Cho. Yes, thank you for the excellent questions. I would like to thank the two panel discussants and also our audience who raised this question online. Thank you very much. Let me answer Dr. Kim Tae-kyung's question first. Well, basically, the small-scale multilateral cooperation you asked about, whether that might be possible between North Korea, China, and Russia, as I mentioned in my presentation. Well, the reason that I chose tripartite cooperation between the two Koreas and U.S. is because I thought about the future direction. Now, what was just mentioned, perhaps it might be easier to pursue cooperation among the friends of North Korea, such as China and Russia. But we really have to think about, is that really so? Because first of all, right now, we are seeing rising confrontation between the U.S. and China. And then, having said that, will China be willing to actively cooperate with North Korea when it is clashing with the United States? So thinking about its own national interests, will China be willing to actively cooperate? And also, China is suffering from the quarantine issue. It's shutting down its borders and its economy is suffering. And the vaccines right now for COVID-19. Well, actually, the shutting down is done by North Korea. Its economy is suffering. So at such a time when essential goods are not being able to enter into North Korea because it has shut down its borders, will North Korea be willing to receive aid or support from the outside world? Perhaps vaccines it might be willing to receive. But what about the other support? Will North Korea be willing to receive support? So I think that Dr. Mount mentioned this as well, but the economic projects, I think, when it comes to inter-Korean relations or North Korea-U.S. relations, can rather create a dynamics for building up a momentum for improving relations, rather, the economic projects. So I think that the traditional friends of North Korea, China, and Russia, of course, will continue to play an important role. And there is a possibility of multilateral cooperation with these countries, the traditional friends or allies of North Korea. But in the case of Vietnam, like I mentioned, well, the United States actually used an inducement policy, using investment to improve its relationship with Vietnam. It was very active in using investment to improve ties with Vietnam. In the case of Cuba, to help out the infectious disease situation, during the Obama period, of course, the U.S. had temporarily suspended sanctions to help out Cuba that was faced with the infectious disease at that time. And that helped improve the relationship between U.S. and Cuba at that time. So if we look at past history, perhaps the United States might be able to play an important role in this type of cooperation. So I'm not saying that Russia and China does not have a role to play, but I mentioned about the bicycle, and I think that there is a role for these countries to play. Aside from China and Russia, I think that the tripartite cooperation can be possible. And how can we persuade North Korea? That was another question that came out. Well, I think I already mentioned this in my presentation, but I think that we need a change of perception, a change of mindset. And we also have to communicate our change of perception and mindset to North Korea. If North Korea continues to just shut down its borders and isolate itself, in the long term, North Korea probably knows that this is not an ultimate solution, a long-term solution. So perhaps North Koreans are watching our session, streaming the session using YouTube, but I'm sure North Korea already knows. So basically, I think that there is understanding among the leaders of North Korea that cooperation is needed. So that is why North Korea, I think it's already cooperating with the international organizations or Russia and China in quarantine. So North Korea has to take action in terms of pursuing cooperation. But why is it North Korea does not want to cooperate with South Korea and the United States? Like I said before, I think it is because of past lessons, what it learned from the past. North Korea, I think, has a tendency to think that if I change first, if I'm the first mover, then I have a lot to lose. As it was mentioned by Dr. Cho Han-bom, I think that a healthcare community or a One Life community, and I think that the importance of soft issues was also mentioned by Dr. Mount and others as well. But we have to emphasize the need emphasize this concept of a community, that everyone's affected, and also we have to work on improving inter-Korean relations to have North Korea on board. So first we have to do an analysis on what are the benefits of cooperation, and then we have to find what interests or benefits are common. And I think that COVID-19 is a very good example that we can utilize. So we can find some commonalities, the common interests of the different countries that should cooperate, and we can use COVID-19 as a vivid case. So we can say to North Korea that we can cooperate on this, that we are changing, send out a signal that we are changing and that everyone can benefit. And the moderator raised a question to Dr. Mount, and I would like to give my answer to that question as well. Now, I want to emphasize the importance of intelligence. The United States, as a hegemony, I think, can play a very important role in terms of the U.S.-Korea alliance. Well, regardless of the U.S.-Korea alliance or the U.S.-Japan alliance, I think that the United States as a country, especially when it comes to infectious diseases, could have played a greater role if it had shared intelligence. I think that if it had done so, the situation would not have become so serious around the world. Because when the Disease Control Center, the CDC of China, made visits, I think that there was this lack of information sharing. There should have been action taking at an earlier stage. So I think that as information intelligence should be shared as public asset, and I think that within a multilateral cooperation framework, there is a role for the United States to play. Intelligence is public goods, and U.S. has a role to play. Thank you very much. So we have heard from the speakers and the panelists.
효율
And you all use your time very wisely, and we met our time limitation very well. In non-face-to-face meetings like this, usually after a meeting, we can engage in personal exchanges and have lunch together, for example, to continue our discussions, but we are unable to do so, which is really bad. But one day, COVID-19 will subside, and I hope that day comes sooner than later with much exerted efforts. And I hope that someday in the future we can have another academic conference with all of you. I would like to thank the speakers, discussants, and directors for joining us in person, and also Mr. Adam Mount, thank you for calling in all the way from the US and sharing your very insightful views. And also to all our viewers joining in online from home and abroad and asking questions, posting your questions. Thank you very much for your participation. Today's session has handled a very important topic, and I would like to thank KINU for organizing this session. And I hope KINU continues to share a practical wisdom in pushing forward the very topic of emerging security. Wishing you and your families all the best in health. I would like to conclude this session. Thank you very much.